So we've had quite a year, and we've invited Paul Manners, co-director of the NCCPE, to share some reflections on the journey we've travelled both this year and actually, since the early days of the beacons, and to reflect a little bit on the future. So Paul Manners, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to you.
Great. Thank you, Sophie, and good morning, everybody. And gosh, Engage is always that sort of moment in the year when we sort of take stock, and it's hard to believe it's 12 months since we last met, and 2 years since we were actually together in person. I don't know who was here at the Marriott Hotel. That was the year of Brexit and Michael Gove and the suspicion of experts, and that all felt pretty earth-shattering at the time. But goodness, then there was COVID, and nearly 2 years later, I think it still feels like we're caught up in that whirlwind. And I think it's fair to say that COVID has really stress tested us. It's stress tested society. It's profoundly shaken all of us and ruthlessly exposed deep-seated structural issues with inequality and racism. But it's also, I think, really reminded us of the need for kindness, for community, and for care. And it would be easy, I think, to lose sight of that as we kind of sit in our kind of virtual spaces, so many of us, and every day blurs into the next. So what we really hope is that Engage this year can provide us with a space to find our bearings again. And in this talk, I just wanted to start by reflecting on the last year and how we can make sense of what's been happening, but also then to step back and take a longer view and try to put the recent developments in some kind of perspective. So starting first of all with the here and now, we have to start with the pandemic, and it's certainly shaken HE as well as wider society. And of course, teams have risen magnificently to the challenge. The work on the vaccines, the work to research inequalities, and universities really stepping up in their communities to play their part. I think it's also made us all very sensitive to how precious the relationship is between us and society, and the connections around knowledge, and real challenges, say around suspicion of vaccines, the really heavily politicized culture wars, the notions of truth and freedom of speech, deeply divisive, sometimes really toxic. So what does all of that mean for us who work in universities or with universities and really care about their social mission? And I think we are so lucky at the NCCPE to work with such a fabulous group of people, public engagement professionals, or PEPs as we like to call ourselves, community partners, researchers, funders, policymakers, leaders, managers in universities, and many others. And having worked so closely with you all over the last year, we've been trying to kind of plot a course, and we've picked up real excitement, I think, and energy at some of what's going on. The way equalities, diversity, and inclusion is much more center stage now. The naming and shaming of the toxic cultures of research and a commitment to tackling them. The momentum behind the civic role of universities, the knowledge exchange framework and the Concordat really building a kind of focus on public engagement, and universities really trying to grip their commitments. And the way UKRI themselves are really moving forward with their public engagement strategy. So, all of these developments are things that are featuring in our program this year. And I think lots of people have said to us, it feels like the stars are aligning. Things are really beginning to come together. I was talking to a colleague at a London university, and he was saying it feels like a kind of once in a lifetime or once in a generation opportunity. There's so much interest and so much kind of focus on engagement in our university now. We've never had that kind of internal momentum. But of course, green shoots, great, optimism, great, but it's been a mixed year for us all, I think. And we know this because of our PEP Insights research, where we worked with a team of peer researchers to examine the impact on the public engagement professional community and thought about the future of public engagement. And this word cloud that Jamie's going to share with us, I think gives you a flavor of how people told us they were feeling and experiencing it. And I'm sure you'll recognize your own experiences in those words, and they'll resonate with what was in the chat. The research really helped take stock, but it also helped us think about some priorities for the sector. And the next slide just gives us a sense of the priorities that really push through a real focus on tackling exclusion, absolutely top priority for people. A commitment to trying to get clearer what public engagement contributes and to really get people focused on why it matters and how it can help. A sense that public engagement professionals still feel kind of quite invisible often, so we really need to address that. And of course, we need to look at the resourcing, and particularly the sort of long-term investment in this space. And lots of recommendations are sort of flown from that and are going to be things we talk about over the next 2 days with a real focus on what actions can we take to move ourselves forward. And as Sophie mentioned, as well as doing the PEP Insights, the unconference, where we asked you to tell us what themes really matter, has been really eye-opening and has really helped us focus our agenda this year in the conference. Over 300 people contributed, and you'll meet a lot of those theme leaders over the next couple of days. So, that's where we are now, kind of poised for action. And over the next couple of days, we're going to be exploring what that means for all of us to take this work forward. But before we kind of plunge into the adventure of Engage, I just wanted to shift gears and try and put some of this sort of buzz of this present moment into perspective. And I wanted to look back and to reflect on how we've got to where we are now and how this might help actually guide us as we look forward. And as we move back in time, I wanted to start here actually with this slide, which was just a few weeks ago, the announcement of a new civic agreement between the 5 universities in Greater Manchester and their civic partners. There's been lots of civic agreements signed over the last year, these long-term partnership agreements. But of course, this is Manchester, so it's bigger and it's better. It's 5 universities working with the whole of the Greater Manchester area, championed by the Mayor, Andy Burnham. It's a wonderful kind of statement of intent of a new paradigm almost for how we work as a sector. And you might say these sorts of bold developments on this sort of scale would have been hard to imagine a few years ago, but would they? Let's look at the next slide, which I was reminded of when I looked at that announcement. This was the Manchester Beacon back in 2008. This is how they positioned their work, connecting people, knowledge and place. And look at the partners that were engaged in that, how visionary that work was. But also, I guess for those of us who've been on this journey, what backbreaking work it has been at times to build that momentum, to get behind these ways of working. And it's a great opportunity today to just shout out to all the other teams that have been working over the last sort of 10 years, the Catalysts for Public Engagement, approaching their 10th anniversary, the Catalyst Seed Funds, the SEPA program more recently, and many others of you who've traveled this road, you know who you are, and that long, patient and dedicated work that you've all contributed to has really helped to make what's happening now possible. That collective knowledge that we've built is really coming into its own, I think. So building on this theme of looking backwards to look forwards, I've also been struck personally by how this sudden prioritization of inequality and of focus on power and privilege, while hugely welcome, is not remotely new. It takes me back 35 years when I was a young, kind of idealistic 20-year-old training to be a teacher in London, and that focus on the realities of exclusion and inequality and how those affected young people's sort of opportunities and their engagement in learning drove our professional practice, and it led to tremendous innovation and risk-taking. And it's so great that in the next session, segueing from this, we'll be hearing about some of this work around exclusion, which really builds on that previous generation of work in engagement and in learning about power and privilege and how to attend to the consequences of that. So it's great, isn't it, to see that rich seam of work moving into the mainstream of HE policy and practice. And I think there's a really important message here that it's vital not to reinvent wheels, but to draw on those important bodies of work and practice that have been conducted in this space, inside, outside HE, within the UK, internationally, and really stand on the shoulders of others. And I think this kind of big picture view is really important. And I think it's nice to think about it on a big picture scale, but also for me, what the last year has taught me is how important it is also to remember the personal. You know, what drives and motivates and sustains us as professionals who work in this space. And this takes me back further in time. And Jamie, if you could put the next slide up. Yeah, this is me with my dad, way back in time. My dad was a lecturer at Bristol University in the vet school, specializing in animal nutrition. And here I am, his happy helper, come technician, helping him collect samples of grass that he would then analyze. So you might be thinking, what's the relevance of this? Well, like many people working in the engagement space, the last year I've been reflecting a lot on why I do what I do, why I care about this work, at the same time as feeling a bit disoriented at times about what it all means and how it all hangs together. But as I was sorting out some of my dad's effects, I had a real light bulb moment that I just wanted to share with you. I came across on a shelf his academic papers, and the next slide will show you just one of the journals that he was published in. But alongside them, with equal pride of place, was a set of magazines for farmers. And this one, I opened it. I thought, what has he got this for? And inside was the article that you'll see on the next slide. An article written by Dr. M.J. Manners about how to take research into animal husbandry and how to use it to be better at caring for your animals. In this case, how to build a creep, as they call them, for piglets. But it was just lovely to discover that connection to my dad, to draw that golden thread to connect us. It helped me find my mojo, and it also reminded me that there's really nothing new under the sun. This commitment to public engagement runs so far back in time, and a lesson that many universities are acting on as they position their new public engagement strategies as a return to their founding principles. So just to sort of wrap up with one other anecdote really about the passage of time and the theme of change. And last weekend I was chatting to a friend of my son who works in a university supporting the NHS, and she's involved in a project to introduce a new profession into the NHS called physician associates. And she was frustrated at how long it was taking. And she was talking about, oh gosh, you know, how hard it is to get people to understand why we need to do this, to address some of the professional cultures that made people really suspicious of these sorts of changes. You know the script. And I was trying to be helpful. And I thought, oh gosh, how can I help her feel less kind of overwhelmed by how hard this work is? So I asked her a question that I've never actually asked myself. And I said, how long do you think it's going to take to get this kind of a change embedded in the NHS, to introduce this kind of profound change? And she said, gosh, that's a good question. 30 years? You know, and I found that really, really reassuring and really affirming, actually, that kind of timescale is realistic for the kinds of deep structural change that we're all committed to. And of course, there'll be leaps and bounds that we're experiencing at the moment, perhaps, but also long periods of slog and frustration. And this is a long game. So, you know, as I look out across our virtual room and think about the visions that we've all got for a new future, a future where engagement isn't bolted on, but recognized as a key part of research and university business, a future where research cultures cultivate collaboration. You know, it's really reassuring, I think, to remember where we've come from, the journey we've traveled, and great to welcome the positive signs we're seeing at the moment of more substantial change in the pipeline. So, you know, what does that mean for us and how we work together? I just wanted to end with a few thoughts about our responsibilities to each other. And, you know, while of course there is a role for individuals on heroic missions to drive this work forward, and we can all use our agency and influence to make a difference and contribute. But if we reflect on the journey we've traveled, I think we just have to remember this is about collective effort. We've got to build on the work of others. We've got to look backwards as well as forwards. And to sustain the momentum, we've got to be really open and generous with each other in our dealings with each other. And and thinking about our collective leadership is actually a topic for this afternoon's plenary. But yeah, I think it's a collective journey that we're on, and I wanted to sort of end with how our public engagement professionals shared their hopes for the future in the PEP Insight research. These are some of their hopes that sort of motivate me, I hope motivate you, and I hope will provide us at this conference with a real sense of shared kind of purpose as we work together. And it will remind us, I guess, of what matters. It'll help us celebrate our success, but also perhaps take a deep collective breath, whatever our roles, and use our collective resources to keep moving forward. So thank you for this chance to just kick off the conference. Sophie.
Great, thanks, Paul. And lots of things to think about, things about the journey. Many of us have traveled, a lot about the past, what personally motivates us for our work, and then thinking about what do we hope for now and in the future around change. So I'm going to hand it over to you, our delegates. So if you want to pop either into chat, like how are you making sense of our current times and what kind of hopes do you have? And I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to think about that. And then I'm going to ask you to pop your thoughts in chat. And if you'd feel comfortable speaking those out, then why not put a little star in your message in chat? And I'll know I'm free to come to you and not put anybody on the spot. So just put a little asterisk in your chat message, and I'll know that you're prepared to speak to everybody about your thoughts. But just take a couple of minutes to reflect on what Paul said and think a little bit about what's motivating you for this work and what are some of the hopes that you have. Okay, so I hope being able to take a breath and have a bit of a think and a bit of time just to collect your thoughts. And already I see people are adding some really beautiful thoughts into chat. So Phil saying, hoping that our experience shows the value of knowledge and learning to the very survival of society. And the next person, LRJC, I am at the start of building a recognized program of civic work in the community. Today, I want to learn from about this group of people. And that's somebody from Robert Gordon University. And Anne, I hope we remember the value of listening and sharing our experience and expertise. Absolutely. And that's a huge important thing about really listening to others and not assuming our frame of reference is the same as others and learning from and with them. D, wanting to bring people together to start believing in positive, creative futures again. Absolutely, I can understand that kind of sense of just really wanting to be able to dream about those positive futures. And in a minute, we're going to have the opportunity to do that together. Discovering new ways of reaching people physically rather than digitally, for example, using the library, realizing the engagement I offer is really valued by those that engage with it and seeing the potential for post-COVID recovery. And that's Irene's comment. Brilliant. Thank you, Irene. That sense of, I must confess, I'm beginning to really long for that now. It's been a long time since we've been able to come together physically. And although it's absolutely brilliant, I know some of you in the room wouldn't be able to come and join us physically at the Marriott Hotel in Bristol. So absolutely, this is brilliant that you are participating here today, but also that longing to see one another face to face and finding other ways of connecting. Alina's excited about all the new skills we learned during mobile digital working and how they can help us work together in the future across countries and to connect people who are really hard to connect before. And absolutely that sense of, yes, we long to see each other physically, but also we long to kind of bring the kind of digital technologies that we're using to enable us to connect across wider geographies and, to connect people who perhaps aren't able to participate in physical spaces. That's brilliant. Thank you, Alina. Jane, everyone has the right to know, understand and contribute to what public money is spent on. Absolutely, that shared endeavour, that sense that when we're spending public money that the public are fully involved and able to find out and participate within it. Brilliant. And Emma, I want to devise a public engagement strategy for my university, which really will make a difference. hopefully it won't take 30 years, and use the momentum Paul mentioned to get it all going with some key people. Thanks, Emma. And I really wish you success with that. I think that there's a huge amount of work conducted by many of the people here at the conference to try and really affect change that makes a really positive difference. And we'd love to learn with you and from you about the work that you're doing. Oh, Nat, maybe I'm just a hopeless optimist, but I really do feel like we're in a period of change. I think over the last 2 years, we've seen a lot of the issues people have felt about HEIs not being connected and transparent and accessible have come home to roost. And it's showing universities that they feel important and key to human development. They're not viewed that way. And so I feel like it's catalyzing change in HEIs and higher education institutions, and also in our approach as PEPs, public engagement professionals. Yeah, I think I'm like you. My glass is always half full, and I too feel that there's a real headwind at the moment, and lots of the things that we've been really trying to shift in the past, there's been much more momentum around them currently. Oh, and Michaela, I'm a simple idealist, always have been, driven by a desire to make things better, more fair. So last couple of years have only strengthened this and emboldened me in that regard. Brilliant. And I think that sense of it's much more in people's discourse is really, really important. Oh, and Dom, I hope that senior leaders in the research sector realise fundamental change is needed, not just a cosmetic change, but something from the ground up. Oh, absolutely, Dom. This is about a significant change of culture, isn't it, across how universities and researchers do their work. And the senior leaders really need to get behind that and recognise the huge value of the work that's been already undertaken in their organisations by people who've been really, really ploughing this path. Thank you, Dom. Emma, I'm excited about involving communities in research in a meaningful way and embedding co-creation in our practice. And I think that there are some really green shoots around that at the moment, with new funding opportunities to support community-led co-creation. So I'm really excited with you, Emma. And JWW, happy with the focus on inclusion, and hope we can maintain it. And absolutely, I'm completely with you there. It's so easy for us to lose sight of that. But actually, how do we build steps to improve our collective practice? And a lot of the workshops today will be exploring that theme. Jonathan, uncovering hidden histories and stories, countering, questioning dominant narratives, and giving voice to excluded groups. Yeah, absolutely. And all those stories that haven't been heard, and actually creating space for other people's stories to be told by them, and to learn more from that. I think absolutely, I'm completely with you there. And I think the challenge of that, the challenge of thinking about the spaces we occupy and how we can be allies to others, but also how we make space for others and perhaps step aside. Brilliant. Thank you, Jonathan. Chloe, I'm motivated by seeing the positive impact our engagement work can have. For example, young women who are excited about engineering being used to create social justice and equality. And through that, I hope to see a more fair and equal world, or at least in the engineering industry. And I think there are a lot of people really concerned about the social justice and equality, and really enabling us to address some of the inequalities in society, or at least contribute to that. So thank you, Chloe. Ellie, it was really good to be reminded that we're on a long journey in our efforts to embed engagement and bring about culture change, and that bumps in the road will be part of it. Yeah, I mean, I think that I always remember when I first started at the NCCPE, my first day I was given this kind of report, and I was told that we had 4 years in which this team of 4 people were going to change every university in the UK to embed engagement at its core. And I remember saying, well, I think that might be a bit ambitious, that actually to change cultures might take a little bit longer. I think I'd hoped it wouldn't take quite this long, but I think that we've learned together, haven't we, that there are lots of really positive things, positive steps that we can take, and we can collectively have a lot of agency, particularly when we align ourselves to really make a difference. And there are a few bumps in the road, but we are making headway, and there is a lot of things, stars aligning currently, that suggest that a really big change, a seismic change, could be possible. Oh, and Jill, I hope to engage with the groups and communities around our institution to make more of a difference. I work in business school, and the expertise and research we have in the school really has the potential to make a positive difference. I also echo the sentiments above about transparency with our research and how we use our resources. Absolutely, Jill. Oh, and Kevin, since I'm new to engagement, I just want to make sure that what I do has a positive impact. Well, Kevin, it's great to welcome you. Welcome to Engage. We love having new people come in, bringing their expertise and knowledge and experiences. And also, there are lots of people who would love to support you and thinking about how to have a positive impact within your context. So brilliant to have you here. Oh, Deanne, I'm encouraged by Paul's reflections, positive but grounded, and the inspiring PEP insights. Feels like we are making another shift towards something even better for the sector and more importantly for society. Absolutely. And I think the PEP insights research that we did with a team of peer insight researchers was really, I found really moving and also really challenging. But also there were some great ideas about what could be done in the future. And Marte, I hope I pronounced your name correctly. In a complex world, people need evidence and understanding how to use it, but we have to connect with people, their world and their experience. Absolutely, the heart of excellent engagement, isn't it? To really be able to connect with people and take and understand their positionality and their ideas and their expertises and valuing those and shaping our own response. Oh, yeah, Harris, I am excited by less barriers to working together. And that would be tremendous, wouldn't it? And maybe part of that, the digital space has perhaps created a bit of that. Oh dear, do you know, there are loads more ideas and I'm not including all of you. And we will write this up and we'll make it available for those of you who perhaps aren't as able to engage with chat. But honestly, some brilliant hopes here. And I think it's just really glorious to see that we are we all want to make a contribution, don't we? But taking it back to 2 years, I remember us talking about that we can't do everything, but we can all do something. And that sense of when we do something together, that can really help build into something really big. Okay, we are going to come to the end of our opening session, and at 9:45 we're going to be exploring some practical tools around navigating inclusive practice. And so we really hope that you'll just take a quick screen break, maybe run around the room if you're able to, or stretch your arms, or go down and grab a coffee, stick your head out the window and, you know, smell in that gloomy air. And we'll be back at 9:45 for navigating inclusive practice with Faye Scott, Louise Archer and Jude Fransman. See you in a shortly. Great, so welcome back. I hope you managed to have a quick screen break. And you will have heard in our opening session that the PEP Insight research really suggested that one of the top priorities for the public engagement professional community was that that it be more inclusive and that we understand better what inclusive practice looks like. And so it's a real pleasure to have secured 3 speakers this morning who have sought to develop really practical tools and approaches to supporting inclusive practice. And we've invited each of our speakers to speak for 10 minutes, and we'll be giving you an opportunity to share questions and reflections in chat, and please do that. And we will then, you know, be able to have an opportunity to have a discussion with our contributors. So our 3 speakers are Louise Archer, Faye Scott, and Jude Fransman, and we really are looking forward to hearing what they've said. I've had a sneak preview in our briefing meetings and in the slides, and I'm really looking forward to this session and getting some real good tools for help. So Paul, over to you.
Yeah, so first of all, it's a real pleasure to introduce Louise. Louise Archer is Professor of Sociology of Education at University College London at the Institute of Education, where I actually studied to be a teacher all those years ago. And she's co-chair of the Centre for Sociology of Education and Equity. Her research focuses on educational identities and inequalities, particularly in relation to gender, ethnicity, and social class. And many of you will be familiar with Louise's work to develop the concept of science capital, which she developed with colleagues, and she's going to talk to us about her recent work to develop an equity compass to guide inclusive practice. Louise.
Thanks very much. So hopefully my slides are going to magically appear in a moment. While they do, I'll be talking to you about the compass that we've developed in a 5-year research practice partnership project called the Youth, brilliant, there they are, Youth Equity and STEM project. That's a UK-US collaboration. So thank you. If I could have the next slide, please. Lovely. So within the project, we co-developed this tool with informal science STEM learning practitioners, really in response to the idea that we kept talking with them about the importance of adopting a social justice mindset. But they quite rightly said to us, well, what does that mean? What does that look like in practice? How would I know I'm going in the right direction? So we worked together. It took quite a long time, lots of iterations back and forth to develop this tool over 3 years. And then we've been trying it out with them and seeing how it works. So they've been taking it and applying it to their practice. And we also have extended it since, working with school teachers, and we've also got a funders version in progress as well. So really it's a conceptual tool. The idea is it's trying to help orientate you towards equitable practice. And if I can have the next slide, please. Thank you. So the idea is the compass sets out these 4 overarching areas and 8 sub-dimensions of areas that are important in relation to social justice and equity. It's a conceptual, a reflective tool. It uses reflective questions. There's a summary document that comes with this, with all explain the background and the sets of questions that relate to each of the dimensions. And it's really there to help you think through and think about and reflect on how equitable or not your practice is. It has these different layers, because the idea is at the centre, it's not so good, it's not so equitable. And what we're trying to do is move ever outwards. And of course, we can always keep going forever in that respect. But so it's trying to help us capture all the elements of equity and then think concretely in relation to our own practice. So if I could have the next slide, please. It has these 4 overarching areas. So the first one is around how do we challenge the status quo? How do we disrupt things? And the idea is that these work across all different dimensions of social justice and equity. But this area has 3 subsections. The first is helping us think about how do we really disrupt those dominant power relations? How do we make sure we're not reproducing power in the centre, but we're challenging it? That can be challenging hierarchies between adults and young people in programmes. Particularly in our context, it's talking about disrupting dominant representations of science, STEM, as white, male, middle class, and so on. So how are we disrupting and challenging and transforming? It also helps us think about whose interests, values and needs are driving our practice. So are we thinking about, are we actually prioritising the needs of the dominant? So it can be industry, the STEM industry, the pipeline in this case, or dominant groups, or are we actually really designing what we're doing from the interest, values and needs of minoritised and excluded communities? We've also got that element there of redistributing resources. So this is helping us think about, to what extent is what I'm doing really giving more to the already privileged, or am I actually actively giving more to those who are most deserving and in need of it? So how am I disrupting the, not just giving more to those who already have privilege? Next slide. Thank you. This teal coloured dimension is really helping us think about how we work with and value communities. So here we've got the idea of, am I doing science, in our case, to, for or with the people in question? Obviously trying to move towards that participatory ways of working where we're sharing power and authority. Also, it has, are we adopting a deficit-based approach or an assets-based approach? So are we seeing the people we're working with as lacking, whether that's knowledge, aspirations, opportunities, or are we seeing, valuing who they are and the rich experiences and knowledges that they already bring and working with those? Next slide, please. So this dimension is helping us now go beyond and do more, and it's helping us think organisationally. To what extent is equity a bit tokenistic, or is it embedded like a stick of rock through everything that I'm doing and that we're doing as an organisation? So that both in terms of my own practice in the moment, but also, is equity everyone's business? Is it mainstreamed, or is it someone, you know, is it their job over there, or is it really mainstreamed and valued properly and funded properly? And if we can have the next slide, this again is helping us extend further, thinking about, are we just doing short-term impact and work initiatives and interventions, or are we working longer term? It's not to say there's no value in the short term, but it's about helping us think of that balance across the piece. Short term on its own isn't going to affect meaningful change. And again, we've also got this dimension of thinking, are we just really trying to help focus on supporting individuals, Or have we got a wider community or society orientation? How can we extend and expand that practice beyond the moment, beyond the individual? Next slide, please. So just to illustrate how this can work in practice, I've got an example. This is quite a sort of typical one. Hopefully they'll be familiar to various people in the audience. Dr. Bridges, so a visiting engineering STEM professional, doing a one-off session in a primary school in this case. And his session was all about designing bridges because that's his area of expertise. And he comes into the session with his key learning point that arched bridges are stronger than flat bridges. That's the thing he really wants the kids to come away with. And they do a fairly typical lolly stick bridge activity where you build a bridge, see if you can support the cars at the end. Next slide, please. So there were lots of positives about this session. The children did increase their knowledge. They did all learn that an arched bridge is stronger than a flat bridge. They met an engineering professional, which for most of them wasn't the usual case. And it was a break from the norm. On the minus side, the children weren't massively inspired. Dr. Bridges' session also largely reinforced stereotypes about engineers. I mean, he himself represented the sort of typical white male middle-class engineer, and it didn't really support the children's agency. And there's a few quotes from children afterwards, you know, so they come away with the idea that an engineer is a man, good at maths and science, needs to be strong and make stuff. And they've also picked up on Dr. Bridges' passion for bridges, which is a lovely thing to have. Some of them felt he's rather obsessed with bridges. He did love bridges, but you may not be the most massive fan of bridges. So it didn't really resonate with everybody. So if we have the next slide. There are lots of good things about his session, but if we map him on the compass, he really sits towards the centre. He hasn't really, you know, in a way, how could we expect him to know? But he hasn't really thought about issues of social justice. It was very much the session doing it to the children. It didn't work with what they brought. Equity wasn't really engaged with. And when we use the compass, particularly in workshop or professional development sessions, we often use Dr. Bridges' example, and you can quite quickly and easily workshop ideas using the compass to see how he could just tweak his session. We're not asking him to change who he is, but just the orientation of the session can make a huge difference to the outcomes and the engagement. If we have the next slide, please. So just a few quotes and bits of impact from how we've been using it in the Youth Equity and STEM project. Amongst our practitioners, we're currently writing a paper on this at the moment, looking at how it supported their reflective practice. It helped them increase knowledge and understanding. We found evidence of critical reflection and intentional action. And in our organisational levels, we've seen changes in the culture. Our partners are bringing in new structures like more permanent youth boards, giving them power and accountability, really thinking about the balance of their programmes, shifting from short term to longer term, and really embedding these participatory and assets-based ways of working that help challenge the status quo. As you can see there, one of the key things is just that. I mean, if nothing else, it's so important to give practitioners time to just stop and reflect. There's so little, we're always so busy, it's such a tough job. Next slide. Thank you. So here, just to finish off, are some links to our various resources. You can download versions of the compass for free from our website. There's a little 2-minute animation explaining it, hopefully in a more eloquent way than I've just done. And there's different versions of the compass briefing you can see on the side. There's one for informal STEM learning practitioners, one for teachers, one for school leaders and governors. And as I said, we're working on the funders version, funders and policymakers at the moment. So I think that's the end of it. You're very welcome to engage with our resources, and I look forward to the chat afterwards. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you, Louise, and perfectly timed. And the slides that Louise and other speakers share will be made available in the Engage Slack channel. And I've seen, Louise, that people have asked you to put those links live in the chat. So at some point, perhaps after the session, if you could do that, that would be really kind of you, but they are going to be available. Oh, Ben's done it for you. Brilliant. Thank you, Ben. And so it's now my great pleasure to introduce Faye Scott. And I met Faye Scott during a meeting and heard about some of her work and ended up having a bit of a sneak preview. And I felt really privileged to do that because I think I've been really excited about some of the work that she's been involved in. Now, Faye is a senior public involvement manager at the National Institute for Health Research, or NIHR, and she's part of their Centre for Engagement and Dissemination. And she's been leading innovative projects focused on diversity and inclusion of public involvement in research. And building public partners to eliminate health inequalities in research is a big passion for her. And recently, she's been working with a group of people outside of NIHR to develop a race equality framework for health and care research. And she's been prepared to come and share that with us today. So without more ado, over to you, Faye.
Thank you very much, Sophie, for your kind introduction, and absolutely delighted to be here today to talk to you about the Race Equality Framework for Public Involvement in Research. Next slide, please. So just to give you a little bit of a context, I'm the founder, also the founder and co-chair of the NIHR Race Equality Public Action Group, which is a diverse group of people made up of public contributors and also NIHR colleagues and people from the academic and health communities. And we've been working together since January of this year to produce a draft race equality framework for public involvement in research. So this is about what tools and resources can we put in place to advance racial equity in health and care research. And although the framework is focused on race, it does have read across to all of the protected characteristics within the Equalities Act 2010. And in fact, some of our pilot partners are already thinking ahead about how they're going to build it into their equality and diversity and inclusion strategies moving forward. So what is the framework? So it's basically a self-assessment tool. And, you know, one of my colleagues at Sheffield actually said, you know, it's a self-reflection tool. And it's about really encouraging us collectively to look inwards at our attitudes, to look inwards at our behaviours and our practice, and how we view and engage and involve communities, whether that's in relation to clinical research, whether it's about sort of co-producing research, or seeking their opinions and insights on various health and care matters. So the audience for this, we think this resource is academics, directors of research, public involvement leads, funders of health and care research. Next slide, please. So we have 5 domains within the framework, and there are 12 self-evaluation questions per domain. And I think it's important to say that this work has been led by the ground up, from the ground up. Okay, it is our public contributors from ethically diverse backgrounds who have said, we need to do this. This is really important. So they have shaped it from the outset. And it's very much their voice coming through in terms of where the focus should be, the sorts of questions that we need to be asking, the searching questions that we need to be asking. So as I said, there are 5 domains. So first domain, individual responsibility. So how are we as individuals highlighting, challenging and eradicating inequality? How are we acting as allies? Are we allies? And is it genuine allyship, or is it performative allyship that is focused on our cultural worldview? Or is it genuine allyship that says, I hear you, I'm going to get alongside you, I'm going to be an advocate, and I will not look the other way when I see injustice? So that individual responsibility is about what are we doing as individuals to challenge the inequalities that we see and to foster good relations. In terms of leadership, and Paul earlier touched upon the importance of collective leadership, and absolutely collective leadership. And we are all leaders, regardless of your role and status within an organization. You have a sphere of influence. So how can we, and particularly senior leaders, foster those behaviors and promote those behaviors that are going to drive improvement, that's really going to harness the diversity of talent and creativity that we know exists, and harnessing it in order to address the challenges, the complex challenges that we are all grappling with. And how are we creating that safe environment for the challenging conversations that need to take place in this area and also in the wider EDI space? And are we ensuring that we are making sure that the resources are in place, that it's well resourced, that we are making sure that people have the capacity and the time to do the work, and that it's meaningful? Again, one of our colleagues here said that we should not have cosmetic change. And you know, this has been echoed by a lot of our public contributors, that they do not want to see superficial tinkering around the edges, cosmetic change. They want to see meaningful change, tangible change in this area. In terms of partnership with the public, so that we just go out to communities where we want to hear from them. We want them to participate in a clinical trial, getting involved in some research, and then they never hear from us again. Do we invest the time, labor, and effort to build those relationships, to reach out to people who, for whatever reason, do not want to engage with us, and to partner with them in a way that is humble and respectful, that says, I don't have all, understands that we do not have all the answers. And we need to hear with an open mind, even when the messages are uncomfortable. And do we really create that platform for co-production to flourish in our work? In terms of recruitment, this is about strategies, diversity recruitment strategies that use data intelligently to understand and map the demographics, that understands the cultural nuances within the communities. The way I would work with the Gypsy, Roma and Traveller community, and I've done some work with them in the past in terms of health inequalities and cancer, is quite different from how I would approach and work with people from the African community. Understanding that cultural nuance is really important. And do we tailor our strategies appropriately? And are we monitoring them for their effectiveness? In terms of systems and processes, it's about understanding, identifying and understanding and removing the barriers to involvement. We've been told what they are time and time again. So what are we doing? And how is it making a difference? And this is about also having flexible ways and models of working that respect the life circumstances, individual circumstances and experiences of diverse communities. That people don't operate in a 9-to-5 hub. And we've got to think about how we work differently and in a more accessible manner to reach diverse communities. Next slide, please. So just to give you a bit of a background in terms of where we were and where we're at now. So we drafted the framework in sort of end of April, and then it went out to community consultation events during May and June. So we held 3 community consultation events to gather feedback on the draft framework. And you know, we have to say that, and it's completely understandable, a high degree of cynicism. But people were engaged and they are hopeful. And they have stayed with us. People from the community who are involved in those events have stayed with us. So really rich feedback. And we've refined the framework. And then alongside that, we have been liaising with a number of organisations who indicated an interest in becoming a pilot partner. And we're absolutely delighted that we have 16 research organisations who are currently piloting the framework and carrying out their self-assessment. And so they started that during sort of August, September time, and we held a number of progress check-in meetings with them. And Now we're going to have a share and learn event in December, and that's where all of the pilot partner organisations will come back, and some of them will be presenting, sharing their early learning, challenges, next steps, you know, what has inspired them and motivate them, what have they found difficult to navigate. And it's about building that collegiate support, peer support network that will be sustained, you know, beyond the lifetime of this pilot. And, you know, I've heard the term long game mentioned a few times, and this is a long game. This is a forever plan of work and should be viewed as such. And what we're doing now is that we're hoping that we will pilot the framework in April of next year. So that's where we've got to. Next slide, please. So what can you do? You can sign up to become an early adopter of the framework, and you may say, well, what does that mean? Well, that means to say that after seeing this presentation today, you're going to express an interest in carrying out the self-assessment of the race equality framework once it's been published. And if you become an early adopter, that means you will access additional support that other organisations will not be able to access just due to capacity when it does go live. So if you get in now, then you will be able to benefit from having the support of REPAG members, including myself. Start conversations about the concept in your institution and start thinking ahead in terms of putting those foundations in place. All of our pilot partner organisations have established a self-assessment team, and they've got a diverse project team made up of public contributors, senior executive leadership who have the capacity and the will and the commitment to drive the change that needs to happen. Am I within time? I hope I am. I'm going to end it there. Thank you very much for listening to me, and I'm happy to take any questions later on.
That was wonderful, Faye. Thank you to Faye. And just to say, we're going to take a brief break just for a couple of minutes to give you a chance to take a breath. So just a couple of minutes before we hand over to Jude. Okay, so yeah, it's my pleasure to introduce Jude. And we first met Jude when she was involved in one of the Catalyst projects I referred to earlier at the Institute of Education. And Jude is now a freelance researcher and activist and an honorary associate at the Institute for Educational Technology at the Open University. And her research focuses on community-based research, multi-stakeholder collaboration, and the sort of geopolitics of knowledge production. Jude's going to talk to us about the work she's been doing, looking at the dynamics of inclusive global research partnerships, and really help us, I think, take another sort of angle on how to deliver equitable, inclusive work. So Jude, over to you.
Thanks, Paul. And it's really wonderful to be here today with you all. So I'm going to reflect on my practice in research engagement, which has really spanned the global level, working with complex transnational networks of academic, civil society, practitioners, social movements and policymakers, down to the national level, working mainly with British and Canadian research funders and policymakers, and then right down to the community level, working with community-based researchers in my local council estate and local government in North London. And I'm going to reflect on some of the challenges around inclusivity that's arisen from this work and conclude by sharing some somewhat difficult lessons that I've learnt in recent years. So next slide, please. Is that? Oh, yeah, there we go. Brilliant. Thank you. So I want to start by raising a more general point about inclusivity. I'm sure you've all seen this sort of map. It's a representation of the global distribution of Web of Science citations. And it's clearly quite provocative, demonstrating stark inequalities in the production of research outputs. But the point I want to make is about the type of assumptions that this sort of representation makes. For instance, that certain regions of the world lack capacity in research, and also the type of policy response that follows. For instance, that these lower capacity regions should collaborate, possibly under the leadership of higher capacity regions, in order to advance in the research and innovation system. But I want to put to you the question of how different this map would look if it included all of those involved in implementing research without necessarily being credited as co-authors, or if it included research published as policy reports or practitioner toolkits or other types of resources instead of just in peer-reviewed journals. So representation is really important. While allegedly highlighting inequalities and exclusions, representations just like this one are also potentially legitimating both a particular type of research system, which privileges a particular type of research output, but also the broader system of research metrics, which presents itself as universal, but serves the interests of a particular type of science, which evolved in particular contexts and may be less aligned with, for example, African interests. So next slide, please. So what I want to do is to think a bit more systemically about inclusion across these contexts. The blue wheel at the center of this figure represents the research and innovation system. So from agenda setting and governance through research design and implementation, communication, and the use and impact of research. In the white boxes, I've modified 4 kind of key central concepts from complexity theory that I think might be quite helpful for thinking through inclusion in the system. First, by considering the starting conditions or the framings of the system, we're asking about where agendas are grounded. Are they framed by domestic policy, for example, the UK's industrial strategy, or international policy like the Sustainable Development Goals? What types of values or ideologies are embedded in these assumptions? In a paper published earlier this year, we unpack this in relation to a particular UK funding initiative, the Global Challenges Research Fund, but it could really apply to any initiative, including the framing of public engagement agendas. Second, by considering context, we're asking about the other systems with which the research system is engaging. So how is it acting on existing hierarchies and knowledge production practices in different places and with different groups of people? For example, a well-intentioned fellowship program to build capacity of African researchers might actually end up exacerbating regional inequalities by supporting a small pool of elite researchers and elite research organizations. Similarly, collaborations that involve giving significant funds to a single community-based organization without considering the broader political economy within which that organization is operating might undermine local networks and place-based movements, many of which take many, many years to build up. And just as an aside, context doesn't have to be just social, but it could also include environmental impact, or what people are calling the grimpact of different research initiatives. And this is why a careful stakeholder or political economy analysis is a key first step of planning any research or engagement initiative. Funders can support this by resourcing design phases of programs and even reintroducing the pathways to impact section in UKRI funding applications, which prompted applicants to think through some of these complex issues. Third, we often think of communities as groups with similar attributes, but even the most locally place-based and superficially homogenous groups will have stark differences. For example, in our Small Action Research Hub in our North London Council estate, participants have different migration status, employment, welfare benefits, housing circumstances, as well as being different ages, genders, ethnicities, speaking different languages, being differently abled, etc. But this difference is an opportunity and not necessarily an obstacle, because it's the tensions between these differences that it's at the tensions between these differences that power can be observed, and that analyses of what needs to change can be made. The real challenge, and I'm going to talk more about this later, is how to manage conflict, which can be really uncomfortable, especially for conflict-averse Brits. And finally, in any work around inclusion, we're aspiring to change, as Faye and others have stressed, meaningful and not just cosmetic change. And in most cases, this means transforming the system itself, not just bringing more a wider diversity of groups into the system. But systems are also always changing, whether in response to climate crisis or pandemics or change in government or whatever. A quick example from my work with the Institute of Community Studies and the British Academy is around how UK communities became both much more hyper-localized and also digitally distributed through the pandemic, with implications for new types of inclusions and exclusions. Next slide, please. Thank you. So now I'm going to share some observations from my attempts to work more systemically within the research and innovation system and across multiple levels. Contexts can't be separated, but they're always distributed politically, and it's important to keep this in mind when working at one level, as there will inevitably be implications for other levels as well. Next, please. Next, please. Thank you. When thinking about inclusion, there's also a tendency to look from inside the formal research and innovation system at ways of incorporating different groups into that system, as opposed to look at the knowledge, practices, and needs of groups operating outside of that system who were implicated in other knowledge practices. Next, please. Engagement tends to be framed positively when actually it can be very damaging, not least because of the huge demands that it can put on people's time and emotional energy, which disproportionately affects more marginalized groups. Next, please. There's also a tendency to focus on the positives, on assets, consensus, and success, which is understandable and very important, but this sometimes comes at the expense of thinking critically about how differences are distributed. And it comes back to our discomfort with acknowledging this conflict and fears of failure, which is also exacerbated by career progression and accountability mechanisms in the system. Next, please. Given the huge demands on everybody's time, we also tend to focus on making the best of existing systems rather than aspiring to alternatives. In our transnational network of networks, the Rethinking Research Collaborative, we spent some time using creative methods like science fiction prototyping to explore alternative international development futures, for example. Next, please. And finally, any significant change demands an update in capacity, which involves unlearning as much as it involves learning. Our system thrives on a particular idea of expertise that individuals preside over and defend their mini knowledge empires. With a move to more commercializable research, there is even more incentive to produce and promote methods, toolkits, and tech as widely as possible to demonstrate impact. But context change and approaches become less relevant. So I think we have to become better at letting some of these frameworks go and looking to others, even if they don't necessarily fall within our own areas of research or expertise. Next slide, please. Thanks. Final slide. So I think I can run through these final lessons quite quickly, as I've mentioned most of them already. It's relatively easy to focus on EDI initiatives within a system, but it's much harder to change the system. But as we know, that's where the real power lies. Oh, pause there just a second. Conflict is so important, and being able to critically reflect on difference and how that's distributed politically is uncomfortable, but vital in addressing inequality. Next one, please. And linked to this, genuine critical reflection is only possible with strong trust-based relationships and an ethics of care, which is not always consistent with our existing institutional structures and practices. Next one, please. We need to stop forcing approaches that are no longer appropriate just because they're grounded in our own personal research or expertise. And related, the individualized way we do research is just not adequate for genuinely engaged knowledge mobilization. We need to recast ourselves as bit players within a broader sense of research questions or policy issues. And that might mean losing attribution, personal attribution as a result. Linked to this, we need to consistently ask ourselves whether we are the right people or teams or institutions to do or be paid for or be recognized for the job. I recently made the decision to step away from the work I was doing around decolonizing international development, as there were many, many more people much more legitimately placed than myself to take this forward. So linked to the previous point, it's often better to be an ally than an expert. Next one, please. And I've also learned the hard way that sometimes, or often, there are more important priorities than research or even engagement. For example, in our Action Research Hub, it became clear that the formal research methodology was getting in the way of vital actions that the community had prioritized. So we made the difficult decision to let some of that research go. And linked to this, never be afraid to quit if a project or role or partnership just isn't working, especially if there are ethical implications around keeping it rolling. We need more narratives of failure and untimely ends. And again, this is something that funders can be supporting. Finally, I think you can skip through to the last point. Yes, one more. Yeah, stop there. So finally, as a counterpoint to all of this, I think it's really essential to recognize that we're not all in a position to quit or take risks or even to engage in research activism in the space. And I want to end by just saying how aware of my own privilege I am, which has allowed me to step outside of the system and be more vocally critical of it. However, when you're dependent on an income to pay bills or support families, or in a more precarious position, it's much harder. And we therefore all have a commitment to use whatever power we have to actively listen to our colleagues and collaborators and to push for changes to make the system more inclusive. And just to end by shouting out to those striking today, because I think this is an important part of the system that we should all be aware of and support. Thank you. Sorry for running over as well.
Great, thanks, Jude. And some really good lessons in that final slide. That and again, these slides will be shared. And if you have questions, in addition to those you've already asked for Jude, then please pop them into the chat. But we're going to, I think we're going to spotlight our panel. So if you've got it on speaker view, you can see us all. And I've got a couple of questions that people have been asking. So a lot of people wanting to become early adopters, Faye, you'll be pleased, and thanks for the information. So for those who wanted to be early adopters of the Race Equality Framework, it's in the chat. But could you tell us, is it just for universities? Could it be a research centre? Could it be a department? Could it be an organisation like the NCCPE? Could you just let us know that?
Absolutely. Fantastic question, Sophie, and yes to all. So just to give you a sort of a sense of our current makeup of pilot partners. So we have a global private sector organisation, we have a local authority, we have NIHR trusts, and we have charities, as well as universities and NIHR infrastructure centres. So it's a very, very diverse mix.
Great, perfect. Thanks, Faye. And now a slightly more tricky question. I'm going to ask all of our panelists, but basically, particularly Faye and Louise, if you applied your frameworks in a, have you got a kind of a more equitable example of what might happen? So we're looking for a different person to Mr. Bridges, or Professor Bridges, or I can't remember. Was he a Dr. Bridges? I can't remember. But either a more equitable example, or if you don't have a more equitable example, Louise, then what would you advise Dr. Bridges did to improve his practice in terms of equity? And Faye, what have you learned about applying this framework yourself? What kind of changes would you expect to see? And do you have an example of that, or are we too early? Because I know that you're in an early stage of the framework. And Jude, from your perspective, I think, where have you seen movement here? So applying some of the thinking that you've been doing, where have you seen movement to really affect change? Everybody understand that question? I'm going to go in that order, if that's all right, because then Louise, you've had 2 seconds more than everyone else to think about your answer. So Louise, over to you.
Thanks. So I hope Dr. Bridges would see it as a journey. I think there are some things he could do immediately, and there are some things that I'd love him to work towards. So as a starting point, it would be great if he would sit down and think about, what are my motivations for doing this? Why am I doing it? I think he's been coming into it with the idea of, I need to get more kids into engineering. They need to know some engineering. I'd like him to turn that around and think, how can I be a vehicle? And so STEM's a vehicle and not the destination. So he's more thinking about, what do these young people in the session want and need? So how can I support that and be a resource? So it will depend on who he's meeting. He might have to do a little bit of homework and find out a bit more about the young people. But really shifting that view of him as the expert with all the knowledge and them knowing nothing. They'll already know, they'll have everyday experiences of engineering. What do they care about? What do they want to build? What do they want to be able to engineer? And to really shift that dynamic, to give up a bit of that power. So it's not that neat, controlled session that he knows exactly what's running to time, but he's shifting it around to draw on what they know and care about, and to support them being engineers, to engineer things that are meaningful for them and their communities, more towards social action. I mean, there are lots of things that I'd like him to do in terms of going beyond the 1 hour session, but I think as a starting point, he could start there and think about really showing more diverse representations of engineers, ideally bringing in other engineers, but even just engaging with those issues, recognising them, recognising that he cannot stand as the representative of all engineers is a really important starting point as well.
Great, thanks, Louise. And to you, Faye.
Great question. So I'm going to sort of split them into two. So what have I learned about the framework? I've learned that I need to maintain my sense of self. It's so easy when you're working in equality, diversity, inclusion to, wherever that's coming from, sometimes it's coming from a good place and sometimes it's coming from cultural change inhibitors, okay? But you've got to maintain a sense of self and be unapologetic, because you ultimately know what you're doing is right and it's urgent. And so for me, it's about holding on to my integrity and not having that compromised in any way, shape or form, and being unapologetic that yes, the focus is on race, we're not excluding anyone. The framework has read across to all of the protected characteristics. The statistics speak for themselves on every social indicator, whether you're talking about mental health, unemployment, poorer health outcomes. Now we're talking about sickle cell, within the NIHR, the health indicators are there. We need to now act. Enough of the stats, we need to act. So be unapologetic. In terms of an example about how the framework is being used, I'll talk about one of our pilot partner organisations without revealing their name. Because when we had the check-in progress meeting with them earlier this month, they said, what I love about this was a few things. They were so excited. They said, I'm getting people my colleagues in my organisation saying, how can I help you and support you to implement this? What can I do? Which is fantastic. But the other nugget of gold is it's emboldened us to have really challenging conversations about race and public involvement and health and care research. And we've never done this before, because I've always been a bit nervous about getting it wrong, saying the wrong thing, putting my foot in my mouth, offending people. And now we have the questions, we just talk to them. And we discuss it in our teams. We discuss it at leadership team meetings. We're talking about it in our training. We're looking at it in terms of our studies, but they're challenging conversations that we can now have and feel comfortable having them.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Faye. And it reminds me of just how frameworks or ideas, albeit, Jude, that they need to be changed and reimagined as time goes on and as we learn differently from different people, that actually they do become tools for talking and for action. They do become a place of allowing that conversation, where so often the conversation is buried deep within ourselves. We can't actually have that. So the framework becomes that tool. So brilliant example there. And Jude, over to you.
Yeah, and I think what Faye was talking about is absolutely spot on. You need those relationships, you need that trust so that you can have those really difficult, uncomfortable, critical conversations. And absolutely, frameworks are so important. They're important to spark dialogue. They're important as kind of contextual placeholders to say this is where we are now in response to whatever policy, whatever kind of cultural practices going on today. And so they're absolutely hugely important. And when they stop being relevant, they're still a hugely important historical resource that we can return to and look at how things have changed and where we've come to. Just in terms of examples of great practice, there are so many, and I can't begin to kind of list them, but just thinking about all of the long-term carefully developed collaborations going on in the UK and internationally between universities and communities. Often they're very individualized, based on personal relationships. Sometimes they're institutionalized, and then more at the kind of formal national policy funding level. One initiative that I've been involved in is the Hidden Ref, and that's been a deliberate attempt to look at alternative approaches to research assessment, which are more inclusive, which are more kind of responsive to the broader array of research and engagement work taking place. And that is both a kind of critical commentary on the existing system, but also a way of imagining alternatives. And then finally, some work that NCCPE are also involved in with UKRI and the Public Engagement Unit, and I'm working with the Institute of Community Studies to look at an approach to community engagement, which really takes as its starting point community-based knowledge systems outside of research and innovation system, and looks to understanding those as a means of then returning to the system and trying to understand how we can join the dots a bit better, so that what we're doing is really responsive and building on the knowledge needs and the knowledge assets which exist out there already.
Yeah. Great, thank you everybody. We wondered if we could just sort of wrap up the session with inviting each of you to perhaps leave all of us with just something we could do based on your brilliant work and your thoughtful approach, something we could each take away and actually start to embed into our practice. And I thought maybe we'd go in the same order again, Louise, and then to Faye, and then to Jude. Any advice?
Oh, any advice? Beyond, hey, look at the equity campus. I think taking time to stop and reflect, I think, is really valuable. As I said, I don't think many education practitioners do get that. And I think we've got this constant eroding of professionalism across formal and informal sectors. And I think that is also problematic for equity and social justice engagement. So I think doing that critical self-reflection and using that reflection for intentional action. So really putting equity and social justice issues as front and centre intentionally, because the default, when they're not there, if we're just doing curriculum, whatever, it's not neutral. The default is the reproduction of inequalities, it's the sustaining of privilege. So I think that real critical reflection, looking at privilege and thinking intentionally, and as Faye was saying, not being, being unapologetic about that. It's not that quality is here and inequality issues are over there. So really putting it into everything. So that's quite waffly. That's my.
Paul, you're muted again. I think you were saying, let's go to Faye.
Yeah.
Thank you. And I'd like to echo everything that Louise has just said. And to add to that, I think what's necessary is for all of us, we're all leaders in this space, every single one of us. And so what we need to do is we need to start leading from a position of the pain that others have experienced. And that pain should grieve us, pain being inequality, pain being injustice, pain being the experience of discriminatory practice time and time and time again throughout society, in every sphere of society, and the burden that people carry of that. So we need to lead from a position of the pain that others experience and use that to generate change from the better, because it should grieve us. And it should grieve us into action. And that comes on to my next point. When it grieves us into action, we need to utilize our spheres of influence. You have family, you have social networks, cultural networks, work networks, professional networks. Utilize your spheres of influence and look at what you can do on a practical level with what you have.
Thank you, Faye. And Jude.
Yeah, those were such powerful words, as someone said in the chat. I feel almost like bad about continuing, but just to pick up again on what Faye has said, I think that recognizing that kind of the deep injustices, inequalities that exist, as Louise said, the need to reflect, and a lot of it's very, very personal and very painful. But then I guess it's also about kind of standing back and realizing that we often get so bogged down in a particular discourse, whether it's around public engagement or research assessment or whatever. And we're having these conversations and it feels completely overwhelming, and we forget that there are other spheres of influence, as Faye says, outside of that. So sometimes it's about standing back and looking at if you're operating at the policy level, like really immersing yourself in this kind of community experience of injustice and inequality, or if you're at the community level, having a way of connecting with what is going on, even if you yourself cannot influence at a higher level. There are brokers and organizations and networks and activists who can create that bridge, and it's about that kind of joined up thinking, which needs to be the accompaniment to reflection, because otherwise it just gets too much and too depressing. I think you have to constantly kind of work out where you're best placed to do this work, and if you're not best placed, who is, and how can you connect up with those people, because we're all leaders but we're also all followers in a way, and we need other people to take the lead at different points. Thank you.
Brilliant. And I think what it made me think, your various reflections, was a point that you made at the end of your talk, Jude, about play our bit, we're a bit in a system, and we can use our spheres of influence, Faye, and we can like really understand our own position in terms of in a critical way and reflect. But actually it's only by collectively can we act to address some of these injustices that are affecting our society, and the tools that Louise and Faye and Jude have shared with us this morning are ways of helping us to take the action we are able to take from a position where we've understood better our own position. So a really stimulating panel. Thanks a lot, and see you later.